Okay, well, I think we'll get started, everybody. Welcome, everybody, to tonight's class on VCarve. Tonight's class is the first in a series of four that I'll be doing this winter. And then next week, class two, we'll be looking at router bits and toolpath setup, as well as some more drawing information. That's not next week, actually, February 4th. And then February 11th, we'll be looking at text tools and node editing. And February 18th, we'll be looking at working with 3D models. One of the questions that often comes up that came up in the list for this class also is what's the difference between the different softwares that Vectric offers? Starting with VCarve and VCarve Pro, probably the couple primary things to think about is that VCarve Desktop is limited to a cutting toolpath file of 24 by 24. They limit that partly because it serves the small benchtop tools. They're able to save some money when they sell it. And they've stripped back a few other features in that. You can use VCarve Desktop to create a larger file, but you have to do what's called tiling, where you actually cut it in sections. So that's why those of you who have the 520, the HD 520, or the 544, or another type benchtop tool that's even larger, VCarve Pro turns out to be the better choice. VCarve Pro also includes a couple of things that has what are called gadgets, which are special apps, which are pretty handy. So things like for fourth axis work, it has them in there. It has some box making devices. Some of the gadgets are really useful. Some are just very specialized. But that's the main difference between the two beyond the price difference. I do encourage people, though, that if they really get into doing a lot of CNC, VCarve Pro does have some capabilities which it's usually worth purchasing. Aspire is a whole other ballgame. It's about, not quite 3 times the price, but 2.5 times the price of VCarve, almost $2,000 for Aspire. But Aspire is a full modeling program. It has all the tools you need to do your own custom 3D modeling for creating relief carvings. I find from all the people I've worked with over the years, and I've been working with these software with Vectric for over 15 years now, probably 80% of the people out there with CNCs get by just fine with VCarve. In fact, I recommend people master VCarve before you move into Aspire, because everything that's in VCarve is also in Aspire. And what Aspire adds are the 3D modeling capabilities, which is a whole other learning curve of itself. I do use Aspire. I enjoy it. I personally don't use it for modeling things like trees and animals or anything like that, but I do it for modeling certain other kinds of sculptural projects. Like I've used it to create some guitar parts and some violin parts, some other geometric type shapes for carving, and it's very handy for that. But until you get some time into your belt with VCarve, there's probably no need for it. If you do like 3D carving, VCarve can do unlimited amount of 3D carving. You just can't create your original 3D model. So that's kind of a lineup of those 3 softwares. If you have more questions about that, don't hesitate to drop me an email and we can chat more about it. The learning curve with CNC, as you all know, it's big. And, these are the 3 big reasons I like to point out. First of all, there's a lot to learn. And here's just part of the list. Number 2 here, sometimes people don't realize this when they get into it. Within VCarve and CNC in general, there's multiple ways to do the same thing. And because the world of CNC and VCarve is so different than typical woodworking, other than having router bits and wood, you have to think differently when you do these setups. And from the design standpoint to setting up the machines, just like with many things in life, there's multiple ways to get it done. So you'll have people say, do it this way, do it that way. And when you're new to it, it's like, well, which way is right? Well, it turns out it kind of depends. And so tonight, I'm going to be showing you some fairly streamlined ways to do things. It certainly isn't the only way to do it. In fact, it may not even be the way that I do it in my own work, but I like to show the ways that are kind of the most obvious to help people get started. And of course, item 3 here, remembering all the above is the other challenge. So we'll go into this incrementally and hopefully get some understanding underway for those of you that are just starting out, and hopefully ease some of that learning curve. And this is part of where I start out with a lot of the trainings I do is talk about what's called the basic workflow. And that's basically how do you go from idea to project? And the diagram on the left there pretty well sums it up. And you see the steps there on the right. You're going to have an idea. You're going to bring it into VCarve where you do the drawings and the tool paths. And then you're going to export that information either to your pendant or to your computer, depending on what you have hooked up to your machine. That information then runs through the control box, which tells the machine where to move. And obviously, you got to mount your material on there and then get your project. Obviously, a very simplified version of all that, because there's a lot of learning that goes on in the VCarve and at the machine. So, but that summarizes it there. The series of VCarve classes I'm going through right now and next month focus on VCarve. So it's those 3 main areas. We're going to be talking about drawing and designing your project and creating tool paths. Those 2 in themselves probably represent the biggest learning curve within CNC. Certainly setting up your machine and getting your material and router bits is a challenge. And you got to have all that secured correctly, but that's a little bit more like basic woodworking. But the programming side inside VCarve is where it all starts. And so clearly that is where the most of the learning goes on. Saving out your G code, we're going to talk about that tonight as well. That's fairly straightforward once you see the basic process. And we'll be going through that in each of our classes as well. As I said at the beginning, some of the information it'll be fairly basic, some will be a little more advanced, some of it I'll be kind of skimming over the tops of it because it's a big topic. But with that, let's jump right into VCarve. I'm going to show you some kind of an overview or give you a tour of VCarve to kind of find your way around VCarve. What are the things I've found in working with people? I compare it to moving to a new town. When you get to town, you kind of want to know where the post office, the grocery store, the gas station, the doctor is, and how you get to those from your house. So inside VCarve, we're going to take a look at all the major components tonight and kind of how they look, how they work together, and then we'll also do some drawing and show you how to do some basic setups within VCarve. You bring up VCarve to start with. You probably, if you have VCarve, you've already done this. You create a new file, which then will bring up this job setup window. The job setup window, the details are in here. I go over these quite in depth in my Getting Started CNC webinar, which I did a couple weeks ago. You can find a link for that out at the Next Wave website. So I won't go into great detail on those right now, but saying it simply is the fact that you've got a machine that moves in 3 directions, X, Y, and Z, and this job setup has to coordinate with that or synchronize with that. So what you do at your machine is what you have to set up in VCarve, and what you set up in VCarve is what you have to do in your machine. And again, we'll go into more detail on that, and certainly the Getting Started webinar goes into that in quite a bit of depth. So once you've created your file, it then goes to the main work area. I'd like to point out to people that this main work area has 4 main areas. You've got a menu bar at the top, which is like a lot of software programs, but the main part of VCarve breaks up into you've got design side on the left, a toolpath side on the right, and a workspace area in the middle. And with it, they each have a distinct function. The other thing that I find when you if you're new to VCarve, there's a few tips and tricks about navigating it, getting around inside the system. So I want to point out a couple things that up at the top, there's these little tiny icons, and sometimes people miss these, but these icons are for navigating and viewing and other help things. So we're going to take a look at each of those. But the first one that you see there is this little arrow. And that little arrow, when you click on the one on the left side, it'll automatically open up the toolpath. If you click on the one on the right side, it'll go back and open up the drawing panel. And we'll demonstrate that tonight as well. But if I were to, like I said, in the actual software, if I were to go in here and click on this one right up here in the drawing panel side, then we would have the toolpath side opened up only. If you're working off a laptop or a small monitor, then sometimes having just one of these panels open is the best way to work because it gives you more work area in the middle for your drawing. Now, once again, you've got that little arrow up here. If you click on that little arrow, then that'll bring the toolpath, or rather the design side, back up. And sometimes people get into the situation where they're clicking back and forth, and then they ask, well, how do I get both of them open the way you showed it? Well, to do that, you go up here to the toolpath tab, because if you click on the toolpath tab, that will also open up the toolpath. Clicking on that tab will open up the toolpath panel. But notice that this panel looks a little different than it did before, and that's because it's right now floating there. If I move my cursor, having worked on this, off of it, it'll automatically hide itself. So that's the next set of buttons I want to look at. We've got these little pins up at the top, and when the pin is vertical, that means the panel is locked out. When the pin is horizontal, it means the panel is in the auto hide mode. And like I said, if I were working over here and I suddenly start clicking over here, working on the drawing side, that toolpath panel would suddenly disappear. So if you want to keep them both open, enter this view that you see here, and then go up and make sure both the pins are clicked. If you want to hide one of them, then you can either click one of the arrows or you can unclick the pin to auto hide that panel. So it just makes viewing things a lot easier, because when you're doing your drawing, you really don't need your toolpath up. And sometimes when you're doing your toolpaths, you don't really need your drawing up, but you have that option for both of them. There's also some advanced features in here where you can actually dislodge. If you grab up here at the bottom where it says design or toolpath, you can actually dislodge that entire menu and drag it off to the side of the screen or onto another monitor. And sometimes that's handy. It gets a little weird sometimes because you got your panels showing up in different places, and it can be hard, a little tricky to get them to relink to the main software. But it's made to do that. So if you want to play around with that, I personally run 3 monitors in front of me. So when I'm doing a big, complicated design, I often will have multiple drawing panels set up on the left screen and toolpath set up on the right screen, and my main screen is just about drawing. So that's why it's set up that way. Now, one other icon you'll see up there is this question mark. And this question mark is also a hidden little gem of information. It's a Get Help button. And the way this works is that any major tool or window that you're in, if you click on that question mark, you notice that it exists both on the design side and the toolpath side. If you click on that question mark, it'll bring up some information at the Vectric website. Here's an example. If you're inside the Draw Rectangle tool, and that's the active tool that you're currently using, and you click on that question mark, it knows that you're inside that Draw Rectangle tool, and it'll take you then, it'll pop up your web browser, and it'll take you to the Vectric website, where then you can find lots of information on the Draw Rectangle tool. Now, I find that some people find this really helpful because what they give you there is a very nuts and bolts about what the Draw Rectangle tool does. Some of the information people find isn't as helpful as they need for their specific situation. So I usually hear pros and cons from people on it, but I find myself every so often, even I still go out there, look for some added information because Vectric is constantly updating their software, adding features to it every version. So there's some things that I have to learn new too with each version. So that again is just another access of resource information that you can access very quickly to find something on that. It may or may not answer all your questions, but hopefully it'll help you along the way. And that takes us back then again to these main areas. I want to focus now, talk a little bit about each of these areas in particular, especially the main three there at the bottom. Starting with the design side, if you notice along the left side over there, there's actually a whole list of tabs. And these are called your design tabs. The first one, the actual design tab, is sometimes referred to, it actually used to be called the drawing tab because that's the main function that you use it for. But you also have some other features called sheets and layers and components and clip art. And we'll be touching on all of those as we go through this series of classes. But for now, it's just good to know that they're all over there. They all function like a panel unto themselves, just like the design panel and the toolpath panel. And they also can be dragged off and separated if you want to have them separate. The design tab or the drawing tab is the one that you'll probably spend the most time in. It has the most, well, obviously it's the drawing tools, but it also now, it breaks down into a few areas. You've got file management information at the top, tools and applications there at the top. In the middle are your actual drawing tools, and at the bottom, then you have editing tools. Those are the three groups of tools that you have in here. In the middle window area, the workspace area, you've got two tabs. One's called a 2D view and called a 3D view. You're going to be spending a lot of time toggling back and forth. You're also going to find that sometimes VCarve automatically flips from one to the other. It depends on the operation. In particular, when you're calculating a toolpath, if we'll do this tonight as a demo, but when you start this window, it will automatically flip you over to the 3D window. And you've probably noticed that if you've used it. It's pretty handy. There are ways to turn that off if you don't like that, but that is one option. So the 2D view, what can be said about that is that the 2D view, you're primarily using that for managing and editing your vectors. Vectors are lines. That's the black square that you see on the screen. But you can also use the 2D window in VCarve to manage your 3D models and to change the size of your 3D models. And layers and sheets are also part of what you do on this window as well. But when you start out, it's the big place you're going to spend a lot of your time in the 2D window designing your project. Having designed your project, you can then it'll either automatically switch over, you can manually switch over to the 3D view. Now the 3D view, this gets a little confusing when you start out. It actually has two different views within one. So I call this the editing view because in this window, you could do some vector editing in this window, and you could also do some 3D model editing in this window, changing the size of things. And we'll take a little look at that later on as well. But you can think of this first window where you see your project. Now, the reason this doesn't look like a board is that this is the actual editing window. So what you have here is this round model in the middle and the square around it. And then over here, you have the actual toolpaths that are associated with that, and you have your toolpaths up here. But I mentioned earlier that when you're calculating your toolpaths, sometimes it'll flip automatically to your preview window, which I'll show you next. This is also the 3D view, but it's what's called the toolpath preview window. The difference here is that this is strictly for preview. You can't do any editing in here. You could just simply preview what your project will look like when you run the toolpaths. So the toolpaths down here in the lower right, the cutting and carving toolpaths, when you preview them, it will take this piece of material and it will illustrate what your carving is going to look like. Now, even though you can't do any editing in this window, I really encourage people to spend a lot of time or as much time as necessary, because this is what you see is what you're going to get on your machine, 99.9%. Vectric has worked very hard in creating this preview tool. And like I said, I've been using the VCarve and Aspire software for nearly 15 years or more. And there's only literally been a very small handful of times where what I saw here didn't happen at my machine. And one of them was perhaps an early version of the software, but usually it's very minor stuff. So this view, this preview is very, very trustworthy, which then gives you a way to look at this and say, okay, do I see what I want? Because if you don't see what you want, then you've got to stop and say, okay, why don't I see what I want? What's going on here? And it's going to typically, I mean, it's really going to fall to two directions. It's either going to be a design problem over here in the 2D window area where you were designing it. Maybe your 3D model is set up wrong or your vectors are set up wrong. Something's wrong with your design. Go back and figure that out if it's not doing the right thing. Or something's wrong with your tool path. You know, one of the things that could be wrong with your tool paths is that you're cutting on the wrong side of the line, or you're cutting too deep, or you picked the wrong bit, things like that. There is one other option too, that like you could cut through your material, or it's the model is in the wrong position. VCarve will even give you some warnings for some of that. And we'll be going over how to deal with some of that when we get to the 3D modeling class. But again, I just want to mention again that this window has a lot of value to it from previewing. And if you think of it, what you see here is what you're going to get. I can't count the number of times I've had people send me a file and a picture and say, how come it cut like this? And I go back to this window and it cut exactly the way it looks like in the window. And there was some error that had gotten into either the design or the tool paths. The other thing you've got in your work area here in the middle, you've got lots of other viewing tools up at the top, and we'll touch on a few of those, but I'm not going to go into any great detail tonight on those, but you can certainly play around with those. Most of those has to do with rotating and moving things around and viewing them in different ways, but you have that other area up there of additional viewing tools. That then brings us to the toolpath side of the layout. And the toolpath side, much like the drawing or design side, can also be broken down into some major areas. You've got your management, setup management at the top, which is similar to your job setup, but it has a few additional features. You've got your toolpath tools there in the middle. You got your editing and your project toolpaths at the bottom. The heart of this setup, again, like the drawing tools, are these toolpath tools. And I like to suggest to people, think of these kind of like different tools in your shop. You've got a drill press, you've got a table saw, you've got a bandsaw, you've got a router, you've got chisels, you've got gouges, you've got all kinds of different molding equipment, router bits. And in the same way, each of these toolpath tools are designed to do a special kind of operation in coordination with the type of router bit you pick. So we'll take a look at many of these, but that's the main part of it right here. Once you get your toolpath created, and we're going to go through that process tonight, but I'm just giving you a quick overview right now. The next step is you need to save these out to your toolpath file or to your thumb drive or to your computer. And to do that, there's this save icon right here. When you click on the save icon, it brings up this additional window, this sub window. And up in this area up here, there's a lot of settings, and we'll take a look at those more closely. But one of the questions that came up tonight had to do with these three settings up here. And like I said, when we get into toolpath settings next week, we'll take a look at each one of those, and I'll go over why and when you might use those. This window also shows you the toolpaths that are being saved. You've got your machine that you have to select, as well as a post processor. All of this is part of this toolpath setup. But once that's all coordinated, then you're going to click on save. You click on save, and that will then save this out to a thumb drive or a computer. And you'll be ready to go to your machine. However, here's one more thing you want to make sure and do, and that is go back into the file menu and do a save on this design file. In fact, it's a good idea to do this several times along the way. I just had my VCarve program crash or my computer lock up this last week, and I lost an hour's worth of work because I hadn't saved as frequently as I should have. But what you're saving here is different than what you saved earlier, the toolpath files. What you're saving here is called your VCarve file. Think of it as your design file and your master file. This is where you do all your work. And make sure and save it someplace safe on your computer or in the cloud or wherever you save your backups if it's a critical design, because all this time that went into this file, if you lose it, then you have to recreate it, just like lots of computer programs. It's also why I highly recommend people don't save their VCarve file to a thumb drive. I know some people, they do that, it's handy, but thumb drives are easily corrupted. They can get broken, they can get stepped on, they can get lost. And if you've got a lot of work into this file, I personally never put a VCarve file on a thumb drive unless I'm strictly moving it from my computer to somebody else's computer. The thumb drive is a great tool for putting your toolpath files on, but you see, we saved our toolpath files from here onto our thumb drive. So if my thumb drive gets broken or lost, I can just go back inside my master VCarve file and save them out again. In fact, I treat most of my toolpath files as very temporary files. If I cut a project this week and they're on my thumb drive or on my computer and I come back a couple months later and I happen to find a toolpath file, I don't use it. I throw it out. I go back to this file, double check my settings and resave it. It's only a few minutes worth of work. It's because these files can end up looking a lot alike. It's very easy to get them confused. So that's why I also keep very few tap files or toolpath files on my thumb drive at one time. And I also do a labeling system, which we'll go into later, that helps keep them organized. Here's another illustration of the difference between the different files. And this is why, like I said, the tap files, these are the G-code files. These are the ones that you take to your machine to do the cutting. The VCarve file, that's your design project, and that's the part that you want to make sure and save out in a safe place. And of course, then you're going to take that to your machine and do the cutting. Okay, with that then, let's bring up VCarve and bring up our first project here. Okay. So this is the design that I worked up, and I'm going to demonstrate this layout, how quickly you could do some fun, simple layouts. We'll talk a little bit about the tools. I'll give you a few tips about tools to have an understanding how different tools work. We're only going to scratch the surface right now. I mean, there's a lot of tools over there on the left side, but let's start out looking. See right here, we'll start like this. I've got this file all set up, but if we were to go back into the job setup, you could access the job setup right over here. And this shows the dimensions for this particular project. We're zeroing to the top, into the middle, and all that looks good. And, you know, one other thing, before we get going on this, I want to show you two more things about setup. Because you'll notice sometimes they get the comment, hey, your screen looks different than mine. And here's why. First off, you see these alignment objects right here. These are not there by default. These are an expanded menu from this tool right up here on the Align tool. If I open this up, These are all my alignment tools. And if you've not used these, once you start using these, you'll find these amazing. They're just incredibly helpful for getting things aligned within your material or one part to another part. Down at the bottom, there's this little checkbox. And if that's checked, it says Show Common Tools on Drawing tab. Now, I just unchecked it, and notice how they disappeared right here. If you have a larger screen like I do right here, it's handy to have those visible all the time. So I typically check that. And that makes them visible. Now you have to kind of learn what each of those mean, but you can go back to that main menu and study that. The other thing that's different here, especially in version 12, you see how I've got a save icon right there. I've got this whole row. I've got new, save, and undo and redo. This row of tools does not show up by default when you open up VCarve, at least not when I installed mine a few months ago. So this one was tricky because I use that a lot. I found it much more convenient to hit that little icon of a little, floppy drive right there rather than go up under File and hit Save every time. You could do that, but I like that Save icon. So the way you get that up there, you have to go deep a little bit. Go into Edit, and you go down to Options, and this brings up a big menu. And for the most part, I would say, until you understand what these options do, don't mess with them. You do have this Restore Original Settings at the bottom, so if you do get all messed up, you can always reset it. But the one we're looking for is down here under General Settings, and it says Show Additional File Operations. Notice how it's checked yes. By default, it usually comes checked no. So watch this. See how that disappeared up there now. And like I said, personally, I find it really handy to have that save icon. So I like to add it. Go back to Options, scroll down to General Settings, Show Additional File Operations, drop down to yes, and that's good to go. Again, if you're feeling adventuresome or want to customize your system, go ahead and go into options, and you can click on some of those, and you can change lots of different details on your setup. Okay, so let's move on now to actually designing this simple project. This is your idea. I've got some dimensions here. I'm going to start out using my rectangle tool. I'm going to open that up. Now, the first thing I want to mention here is that this anchor point, think of the anchor point where everything gets measured from. So if my project is going to be 14 by 2 or whatever size it is, it's going to measure based on that as the center point, or in this case, this would be the 0 point. So it'd measure 14 to the right and 2 inches up. So everything's going to expand from wherever that anchor point is. You can also specify where on your drawing that anchor point is. And right now, the anchor point is set up at 0, 0, which is the middle of my drawing. That also happens to be my datum point. So that's convenient. So I want this rectangle now to be anchored on the datum or anchored at the 0, 0 point, and I want it to draw itself based on that as the middle of the object. So I'm going to go in and grab some dimensions. Our width of this is 15 inches, and the height is 4 inches. And click Create, and it plots that rectangle exactly where we specified. Next up is, we've got some circular shape here in the middle. So let's add a circle to the middle of that. It looks like it's 6 inches in diameter. So we go inside the circle, and here, rather than anchor point, we have what's called center point. It really is the same thing, but with the rectangle, we've got 4 corners in the middle. For a circle, the most practical thing is we have one center. So center point, anchor point, it's the same thing. And almost all the drawing tools have that as an option. If you want to plot out your shape in a specific location, That's one way to do it. So right now it's X, Y, and X0 and Y2, and we've got a 2-inch radius. These aren't the settings we want, but watch what happens when I click. So there, it popped it 2 inches in the Y, which happens to be that location right there, and 0 in the X with the 2-inch diameter. So you can see how it's very precise. I, of course, could also just go out here with my mouse and just click and click and click, and I get all variety of circles. Since I just clicked on this one, I can also go in there and actively change the size. So when your object is actively selected, in many of the tools, you could go in here and mess with the size of it. So let's change that to 3. And then let's go back here and change the center point to 0, 0, and click apply. And notice what it did. It moved it right there to the middle, and it changed the size. Now we want a 6-inch one. So let's type in 6. And there's our 6-inch circle in the middle. Now I have these extra ones out here, so I can select it. Lots of ways to delete it. Perhaps one of the easiest ways is to hit the delete key in your keyboard. You can also bring up the local menu. You can see there how it says delete. I bring up the local menu by right-clicking. So I select it, and then I right-click, and the local menu with this selected object, these are things that I can do to this object. Notice I can't group this object because I've only got a single object. I can't convert to vectors because it's already a vector. It's not text, so I can't do anything with text. So only the things that are available here are things that I could do to this object. So I'm going to delete this one also. And I now have my 2 primary shapes. We also have some inner shapes here, but rather than try and calculate those out, I'm going to show you a quick way to create those using a tool called the offset tool. But first we need to simplify this shape a little bit. And for that, I'm going to go ahead and use this, what's called the interactive trim tool. It's a pretty powerful tool. And right now there's some different ways you can use it. I'm going to uncheck that box for now as a demonstration. And it's just simply a scissors. And notice how when I get over the line, it opens up. So I go left click, click, left click, and it snips it away. So now I have my outside shape. However, when I click on it, notice how I actually have multiple shapes. So let's take this shape. I'm going to highlight it. And I can fix this in 2 ways. One is I can go into this tool called a join tool. And the join tool will join vectors. And this, we've got 4 open vectors because we have 4 sections to this shape right now. The tolerance is how much of a gap it'll span. And usually I leave that pretty small because I really just want to join lines that are close or almost invisible in their break. When we're joined, we're going to have 1 closed vector. So notice this. We're going to hit join, close, and now I have 1 continuous vector. Now I'm going to back up a little bit. One of the best keys in the keyboard is Control Z. So I'm going to watch when I hit Control Z once, twice. And now I'm back to all my major shapes. So Control Z, you can go back. I think there's a setting for how many times you can go back, but it's several. So it's pretty handy. What you have to realize is everything done up to that point will also be erased. So it's going back in order of creation. Let me go back inside that trim tool a minute. I had unchecked this box right here, Many times in this situation like this, you actually want to leave that box checked because what that does, it automatically joins those parts back together. So you wouldn't have to do that other step. I showed you that other join step because I get a lot of emails from people that say, hey, my toolpath isn't working. It's cutting in two parts or it's cutting on two different sides. And usually it has to do, they have a break in their vector someplace. And this is one of the places that it can come in. Either they forgot to check the checkbox or for some other reason, the lines got broken. So now when we do this, now also, if I have a lot of lines to snip, all I have to do, rather than going one at a time, I can hold down the left mouse button and just touch them and they'll disappear, just like that. So if you have a lot to get rid of, it's more efficient. Now I can close out of that. And now we have automatically one nice continuous vector. So next up, I'm going to work on creating these extra lines for this border design. And we've got some dimensions here. For that, I'm going to use an offset tool, which is a really handy tool in lots of applications. In this case, you have to make a decision. We're going to start with our outer vector, and we're going to obviously offset it inward by 3/8 of an inch. So let's type in 3/8 of an inch. Creating sharp corners will make sure that this little sharp corner from circle to square is kept. Otherwise, it'll create a rounded area. So I want to keep the sharp offset corners. I don't want to delete the original, so I'm going to uncheck that. And I want to select the new one. So watch what happens when I click offset. There's the new vector, and it's automatically selected. And now I want to go 1/4 of an inch. So I change my dimension to 1/4 of an inch, offset that, and I have my other set of vectors. All very quick and easy. So that brings us to our basic shape. Now we're going to add some text to this. And there's several ways that you can manage the text. We'll go into a lot of detail on that during the text class. But for now, I'm simply going to go in and select text. We've got it set up for text up here. Text is one option that gives you lots of freedom. Text in a box, we'll take a look at that a little later. But right now, I'm just going to put text. And then I'm going to click down here, just any place on my screen. And you'll notice that it brings up a little rectangle. And that rectangle represents the letter that you're going to type or the letters. This little dot at the bottom is, you can think of this again, much like the anchor point. This is where it's going to reference. So right now we have it set up at the center, which is center justified. So it's going to go left and right equal amounts. If we were to click it on the left, notice how it moves that to the left. And then if we type something in, right, see it clear, it moves it to the left. We could go back to center or to the right. So it's much like a word processor as far as the justification. And we'll put that on center. Notice here you've got anchor point, just like I said. Now in this case, the anchor point is always this blue dot. It's never the middle or one of the four corners in this app. It's always this dot, which is related to the text alignment. So we could probably make this text a little taller. So let's make it 2 inches tall. And let's use an anchor point of X0. So that's going to be right up and down on this line. So let's do X0. But then for the Y, because we're 2 inch tall text, let's drop that down to -1 inch. So if we go -1 inch, that'll accommodate our 2 inch text and it'll center it nicely on our design. So that's how that anchor point is used. So let's finish typing in our text and it fills it in nicely. Now, I've been showing you how to plot out and very specifically place items. This sometimes, and I do a lot of this too, I just call it free design, as opposed to plotting all these places out with all those specifics. You can go in and type down here, even in the gray area, and let's do this. Do another one here, River Place. And I can take this text, and if I get that cross arrow, I can drag that around. I can manually shrink and enlarge it. I can even get very custom with it and stretch it like that. You can even rotate it, and we'll look at a lot of that when it comes to text management. But there's nothing that requires you that you have to plot it out like I showed you. So you've got a way of plotting it out specifically, but then there's also free design too, free layout, where you have just a lot of freedom with all your shapes. And that goes not just for text, but any of these shapes that I drew tonight. You can pop those in any place you want, and you can also then scale them on the fly, and you can stretch them. Take a circle, put it into an oval. It's just amazing the amount of flexibility that VCarve has built into it. So we have all of our primary vectors set up now. And so now I'm going to move over to the toolpath side. And we're going to use two primary toolpaths. I mentioned to you earlier how toolpaths are a lot like tools or different tools in your shop. And for this middle one, we're going to use a V-carving toolpath, which is specific to CNC work. It represents incised hand carving, or even some of the old type of template lettering. V-carving, I'm a huge fan of it because it allows you to create very nice looking carving and creative carving very quickly with very simple vectors. And the carving time on the machine is also quite quick compared to the more compared to 3D model carving. So we'll open up the toolpath. Couple things we need to do is just look at some of the settings up here. The start depth, typically you leave that at 0. That means that the bit is going to start at the top of the material and cut down into it. So that's the default setting. And for most of your projects, if you're cutting on the surface of your wood, you're going to leave that at 0. Flat depth is something we'll take a look at later, but if you have very large letters or very large V-carved areas, you can actually add a flat area to the bottom of the carving. But for now, we don't need those. We do need to select our correct bit for this. So I'm going to go into select. And I've got a basic tool bit toolpath or tool setup right here. And all that's showing here right now are the tools that VCarve recommends. I have more tools in what's called my basic tool set than what you see here, but these are the only ones that they recommend using. So I'm going to choose the 90-degree half inch. And just so you know, I'm sure this looks different than yours, and we're going to talk about that after I finish this design, how I got this to look like this. And it'll be kind of an intro to next week's class on everything tool database related. I like my settings here that I've already got, so I'm just going to click on select. We now see the V bit listed up here in the upper right. The rest of the settings here are pretty much just leave those as default. I now, for naming purposes, I typically go into my files and I give a very short abbreviation, Clear Lake. That represents the name of the project. And then this will be the first router bit that I cut at my tool, so that I'll give it an 01. And I click calculate. Now, no suitable vectors. Okay, that's the last thing I have to do. I'm going to select that vector, hold the shift key down, select that vector, hold the shift key, keep the shift key selected, and hit that one. That's one way to select multiple vectors. Another way to select them is just drag a little selection box from right to left, and everything that box touches will be selected. That's a right to left movement. If I go from left to right, it does nothing, because when you go from left to right, the only thing that it selects is what's inside that area. So let's watch this. I will just do those. Notice how I'm not covering the major design. So it did select those because they were inside that. But that's where this little tiny move right here from right to left is so handy, because it'll select all those very specifically. So again, as you can see, multiple ways to select things. You'll find which of those work best, and eventually it'll just become second nature when you start working with a project. Now that I have those selected, I can click Calculate, and this is where it will automatically switch over to this 3D preview window. In fact, it'll be the 3D toolpath preview window, just like that. So this is our toolpath preview window. The blue areas show us where the router bit is going to be cutting. The red areas show where the router bit is moving through the air above the work. And the light blue ones are showing where the router bit is plunging down into the work. We also can click on Preview Selected, and it previews the cutting for us. So now I'm going to close out of that, which will take me to nothing looks like it changed here, but this is actually, because you see the toolpath operations, this is actually the 3D editing window. So I can edit things in here if I wanted to. Now, one of the options, we talked about these options along up here. I'm going to click on this, which will reveal my vectors. So there's all my vectors from my 2D window. In fact, let's just split those using this split tool up here. This is a picture, so obviously that's not showing, but my vectors for my dimensions and my main project are all showing. And if I want to re-enlarge this, I can hit this button right here to re-enlarge it. Now notice how these are showing up pink. That's because this toolpath is selected or highlighted, and it's showing us which tool or which vectors are associated with that toolpath. In fact, you can see the same thing in the 2D view. It's selected. Now I can deselect them, no problem. But if I go back and click on it again, it will reselect them and associate those again, so you can tell which ones are associated. When we do the next toolpath, you'll see how it's even more useful understanding that. But for now, one of the new things in VCarve 12 is the fact that my vectors, like that vector on the outside, are showing in the 3D. That's new with version 12. So that means I don't have to go back to the 2D view to do my next toolpath. I can simply select my profile toolpath. Now my material is 3/4 of an inch deep, 0.75, but I'm going to set it to cut just a 10 thousandths or 0.76, a little deeper, so I make sure it cuts all the way through the material. That's a pretty standard process in CNC, somewhere between 10 to 20 thousandths. It'll go through and cut your spoil board a little bit. You don't want to do that if you're working straight on your metal table, but if you have a spoil board or a sacrificial board under your project, then it's a good way to make sure you cut all the way through. We're also going to select the correct tool. And now you can see I have more bits available. I'm going to do the 1/4 inch end mill for this. Click select, and my 1/4 inch end mill shows up. A few other things that I need to do is I want to make sure I'm cutting on the outside. I'm going to skip over these other ones. I do want to add what are called tabs. That'll keep this project from falling out after it's all cut out. So I click on tabs. And then the length of the tab is basically how wide it is. The thickness, is how thick it is. And the 3D tab looks like a pyramid versus the standard tab, which looks like a brick. I prefer the 3D tab because the router just keeps moving, goes over, kind of like a speed bump. It slows down a little bit, keeps going. It saves some time. It leaves a little better finish on the edge. The brick tab is stronger for the same dimensions, but the router literally comes, stops, travels up, goes over, and travels back down. So it takes a little bit more time. Not that that's a huge deal, but it can leave a bigger mark on the edge of the wood. So 3D tabs have kind of become by default. Now notice when I click on Edit Tabs, now it automatically switched back to the 2D view. And that's because we have to do our tab work inside the 2D window. Now, it's real simple. I can simply go in here and click wherever I want to put a tab, and I can consider that good. Or, let me delete all these. Or you can go in and pre-program how many tabs you want and click on Add Tabs. Let's add 6, actually. Let's put 6 in here and add them, and it'll add it like that. Now that's probably more than you may need for this project, but that's okay. We'll leave it like that for now. Click out Close. The number of tabs and the placement depends a lot on the size of the tabs. These tabs are fairly small, and plus with the 3D, you've got a small pyramid shape, so I think this will work out fine. We'll talk more about this later, but I'm going to do what's called adding a ramp, a smooth ramp about 1 inch long. Think of a ramp as like a boat ramp going into the water. It's easing the router bit into the material, and that's easier on the router bit. It's easier on the material. It's easier on your spindle. It just takes the stress off things, and often will also create a better finish on the edge of the project as well. So that's usually advisable. People recommend anywhere from 2 to 10 times the diameter. A lot of it has to do with how deep you're going. On this one, we're only going about 1/10 of an inch. So 1 inch is plenty long for that ramp. When people on large machines are cutting through a full sheet of plywood in one pass, which they do, they may actually go over 10 inches to get down through that entire material. Okay, now we've got, this is called a profile tool path, but let's rename this one also. And this again is our CL for Clear Lake. And then we're going to type in O2 since it's the second tool path we're going to use. And then we're going to call it cutout. Just a simple name to help us know what it is. Now, some people like to add the name of the router bit after it, and you're certainly welcome to do that. However, as I pointed out in my webinar last week in the pendant, you're able to look at the pendant in your thumb, when you put your thumb drive in, and it actually shows what tool bit, router bit you set up for that tap file. So you don't actually need to have it in the title because it's right there in one of the preview windows before you hit run. And so that's why I usually don't add it. Click calculate. Now we get this warning because it's telling us it's going to cut through. We know it's going to cut through, but it's giving you that warning anyway. And I'm okay with that. And now again, it switches back to the 3D view. Now, if I hold the left mouse button on my keyboard, I'm sorry, the right mouse button, I can rotate that. Same as I can if I rotate this ball up here. And if I click on one of these surfaces, it'll automatically rotate to that. Now that's the bottom. If I want to go back to the other side, I double click it, and it'll rotate back to the other side. So that little rotation square up there, cube up there helps you also, but I can also do it with the right mouse button. So I'm going to rotate this up, zoom in a little bit, and here you can see the multiple passes. Each one of those represents a pass as it's cutting in layers, and there you can see the 3D tab that it's going to leave along that edge. So let's zoom up here, and then let's preview this. And there we can see our 5, 6 tabs. And yeah, that looks good. That's going to work out well. Now, a couple of other things to talk about with this previewing and tool paths, some of the basic elements of understanding how all of this works. sometimes after people have created their toolpath, they're not happy with it, and they say, "Oh, I need a different V bit or a different V toolpath," and they go and start creating another V toolpath, VCarve toolpath, and they get a whole bunch of them, 2 or 3 of them, and then they're like, "Well, which one is my best one?" Here's the deal: keep this minimized to only the ones you really need, because if I don't like something in this tool setting, I can either delete it, delete this, or I can simply open it back up and edit it. And, if I wanted to give it another name, VCarve, 2 of 3 or something, whatever, I could add that information. So there's really no need to have toolpaths here that you're not using. You can also go directly in here with a right click, local menu, rename it. You can also reorder these, hit down or up, depending on how many you have. And as I mentioned in my pendant webinar, which I did last week, and as I'm showing here, the numbering of these is important because VCarve in here, they get ordered however you order them. There's no sorting. Everything is manual. But when you save these to your computer will sort these numerically and alphabetically. When they go to the pendant, they get in there kind of random, and sometimes they go in there by the order you saved them. It's not fully predictable, and that's why I like to actually put a little project item at the beginning, ID at the beginning, and then order them according to the number. It's just a little tip. You don't have to do it that way, but I find it pretty handy to keep track of these. Okay, now that I have these, I want to just pause for a minute. And anybody have any questions about what we've covered so far in this part of the VCarve talk? Any of those techniques you'd like me to expand upon a little bit? Okay, with that, I'm going to show you a couple more things in this preview window. One of them is people say, well, how do I get back to the toolpath preview? What we have here is the 3D view, but this is the editing window, because notice that I could go in and I could grab that vector. And if I want to change that vector, I could change that vector. And I don't want to do that, so I'll hit Control Z, but you can actually edit it here. Getting back to the preview window, it's kind of like, it's a little bit like the YouTube icon right here. You click on that, and if you want to manually go back into it, here's where you can view it. And then we'll click on Reset, and then we can view these individually or together. Now, I want to give a little overview of these different buttons here, because one of the things that confuses people is the difference between selected and visible. Notice how this button says Preview Selected Toolpath. It's singular. There's no S at the end. And that's because you can only have one selected toolpath, and that's the one that's highlighted down here. So this is the cutout, and that's the VCarve. That is the difference for selected. And also notice I can't see anything in this picture here. That's what the checkbox is for. The checkbox makes them visible. So I can have multiples visible, and that's where this one comes into play, where if you want to preview your visible toolpath, that'll preview everything with the checkbox in it. So you just have an understanding of the difference between preview or selected and visible. This also comes into play when you go to save your toolpath, because you have visible and selected options there as well. Of course, preview all, that's pretty obvious. That'll preview all of them, just like that. You've got a speed control here. You've got some advanced settings, much like a video player for advanced or step at a time or slow or fast speed. There's some other settings up here that we'll talk about at another time as far as adding color and materials types. But that's the primary thing to point out here. So again, we can close out of this, go back to our edit window, and we can then go back and toggle it automatically. Or if I want to open up a toolpath, I just double click on it and it'll open up the edit window for the toolpath. Also notice that if you hold your mouse over here and pause it, you'll get the critical information popping up for that toolpath. So it'll tell you the bit that you're using, the feed rates, it disappears after a few seconds. And the feed rate, the spindle rate, the depth of cut, the estimated time, all variety of information is pretty handy right there. The other thing while we're talking about basic toolpath information is let's go back and I'm going to split these views again, and let's bring this one up like this. And let's bring that one up right there. So I just zoomed in on both of those. We talked about visibility. So first off, if I highlight cutout, notice how the associated vector, this outer one on both views here, is showing up. If I go to the VCarve, then it goes to the other ones. If I check the box, let's go with this view first. This is the default view. You can see where the tool is traveling. And this is often handy. With the cutout one, it shows us that it's traveling around the outside or to the right side of that line in this case, and that's useful. Shows us where the little tabs are. But you just saw a sneak preview of that. What's really useful is this icon right here. And that shows you the actual kerf of the toolpath, which is particularly valuable when you're cutting around an object or inside, because it gives you a very clear view of what's going to be where the kerf of the router bit. So if for some reason you accidentally cut on the wrong side of the line, it will show up and it'll show that. And there are some settings and times where you actually have this router bit cut a little bit off the line. And we'll talk about that when we get into the details on toolpaths. But this blue preview, the solid one, which is accessed right up here, is very handy that way. Okay, so we're going to turn that off. I'm going to go back in here and refresh that. So when I go back to my main window, all I'm seeing is just my material viewport here. Now, again, you've got these other tools up here. They have a variety of settings. You can play with those. They do no harm. So, I can turn that off. I can see where the green is actually my material. I can see where my XYZ is, some different things like that. And so you can work with those. There's some other views over here. This is a perspective versus a straight on view. So it zooms it back and forth. But what I want to talk about while we have a little bit of time left is I want to go inside and talk a bit about the tool database. And this will be a bit of an intro to next week, but I want to give people a taste of what we're looking at because there's a lot of questions that come up on this, and we'll have a lot to cover on this next week. But you saw how I set them up. I have this basic setup. Now, as I said, your toolpath database is not going to look like mine. What you get with yours from VCarve, from Metric, is you get an Imperial Tools group and a Metric tool group. And there's lots of different bits inside each one of those. And you can certainly go in and edit those as you like. The great news about this tool database, which also makes it a little challenging on the learning curve, it's incredibly flexible. So I can go in and add and delete tools at will, any way I want to. So what I want to do for the remaining of our time is show you how to set up a basic tool group set. So I have these different groups I've created. I'm going to go in and I'm just going to highlight this last one because I want my next tool group to show up, not within that, but it should place it right below it. So I'm going to go down here and right on this icon, it says add a group. And I'm going to click on add a group. And for some reason that one expanded. But here's our new group right here. And the name of it's over here. So I'm going to rename this, and I'm going to call this my shop bits. And then I'm going to click apply. And now I have a tool group called my shop bits. And the reason I show you this is because you could take your shop bits and create a tool group that just has those bits in it. And I have a couple of versions of software that I run. And so some of them, I just have one, and I think I have it in here too. Yeah, there's Randy's shop. So my bits are inside that one, and I pretty much hide all the others or delete them because I just don't need them because I don't have those bits. But once you have this group set up, then having the group selected, we're going to create another group. And notice how it created it as a subgroup. That's good. And then I'm going to call this end mill bits. Click apply. I'm going to highlight my shop bits again because I want the next group to go under that again. And it doesn't always happen. So let's open this up, grab it, and drag it up on top of that. And there, now it's aligned. I have found that it gets a little bit, it'll do that occasionally. So you just have to learn how to move stuff around. It's not the best at organizing with that, but you can eventually get it moved back into place. So this one I'm going to call V bits, hit apply. Now let's try it again. I'm going to go to my shop bits and let's hit group again. And that time it worked. So it works some of the time, most of the time. And this one, let's call this one all those bits and apply. Now that I've got my three subgroups set up, I can reorder these if I want. I can drag this up to that one and reorder them if you choose to. But now I've got end mills. Let's start out with the end mills, and I'm going to go in, and now I'm going to hit the big plus sign and add a tool under that group. And it typically will default to the ball nose because that's the first of the list. So I'm going to change that to end mill. And it'll come up with some size. I want to add a, 1/8 inch. Yeah, I'm going to start with the 1/8 inch on this. It's going to be a 2 flute. I'm going to create the settings. And I'm going to take a look at these path depths. That's about half the diameter. That's just fine. And 40% step over is the default. Spindle speed in this case for my machine, which is a 520, that's a fine spindle speed. The feed rate and the plunge rate, I'm okay with those as well for most work. Let's click apply. And so now I've got that one set up. Now I go back into end mill again, click on plus, it adds another one, and it just happened to create a 1/4 inch. Oh, that's a ball nose. Let's change that out to an end mill. Now we're back to 1/8 inch, so we'll change that to 1/4. 2 flutes, create the settings. Again, these work fine. I think I'm going to change this to 20,000 for my tool. I have a 3-horse spindle. I like to run around 20 to 22 on mine. We'll talk more about that next week, depending on which machine you have. Hit plus or apply. So we've got that one established. And we just keep doing this, adding as many bits as you want by category. And on this one, we'll make a 375, 2 flutes. And again, that looks fine. Apply and say okay. Oops, now that closed it when I hit okay. Let me go back in. I didn't need to hit okay. All right, so let's open that up. So this is where you can add as many bits as you want under any size. Now, any given bit, you've got this notes category up here. So, you could put the brand name in there. You could put the model number in there. You could put any additional information that you want in there. And then let's talk a little bit about, so that's the V end bits, and 40% step over is pretty common right there. Let's go ahead and add, oh, let's apply that. Let's go ahead and add a ball nose bit. And a 1/4 inch ball nose, that's one of my go-to bits. So let's use that one. And on the settings here. Now a ball nose bit, your 1/8 inch, your 1/16, your 1/4, they're often used for 3D carving. And so on the 3D carving, your step over is going to be pretty small. So I typically run my step over at about 8 or 9%. And I'm going to set these ball nose bits up for 3D carving, not for other kinds of cutting. So that's why these settings are going to focus on that. And again, I'm going to show you some illustrations next week, which will explain the rationale between how you set up which bit for what kind of carving. But for now, these will work, and I'm going to click apply. And I'm going to go in and set up another one. Let's set up an 1/8 inch ball nose, which is pretty common for 3D carving, 2 flutes. And I'm going to change the pass depth down to 30 thousandths. I rarely cut more than 20 in my 3D carvings with the 1/8 inch ball nose. I'm also going to change this down to 8 or 9. That's usually where I end up. This will give me a real fine detail with that. It'll leave a very smooth surface. I'm going to turn the spindle speed up a little bit for the smaller bit and click apply. And then we do the same with the V bit. Now the V bits are a little different than other bits. This is a 1/2 inch diameter, 90 degree. Put in 2 flutes on this one and hit create settings. I don't like cutting that deep with a V bit, so I'm going to change that to an 1/8 of an inch. Actually, a 1/10 of an inch is usually what I do. Conservative, and that's because of the shape of the bit. It'll go a 1/10 of an inch deep, but at the top of that cutting, it's twice that wide. We'll talk more about this too, but this 2 and 20%, I encourage people, leave that alone. Those are the default settings for a V bit. And what this is telling you is that the clearance or the roughing part of this V bit is going to do it a 20% step over, and then the final pass is going to come back at 2%. These settings work well. I mean, I use mostly 60 and 90 degree V bits, and I found those settings work really well for both those settings. So I just don't change those, leave those alone. Those work well. The rest of the settings look good, so I'll click apply. And again, you can go in and add as many bits as you want, but suddenly you have created within 15 minutes, you've got all your bits listed, and you've got them set up with some basic feeds and speeds in here. And next class, we're going to talk about how to set these up for a particular type of material and why you would change it and when. And then now we can click OK on that. And if we were to go into one of these tool paths, we could go in, and right now we've got the V bit selected for basic tool set, but I could go into my set, my shop bits, and select that one. It really has the same number on it, so you're not going to really see a change, but that has different settings then. Well, that about wraps it up for tonight. Any questions from anybody?
Are you going to cover machining time, the next one?
You know what? I'll cover that as a question right now.
Okay.
We got a few minutes left. That's a great question. So the question of machining time, we saw how when we hold the mouse over this area right here, how it shows you let's see if we get it here. It shows you a machining time, estimated time down there at the bottom. The other way to view that is right here in this clock. And it's showing here that we're 23 minutes for one and 3 minutes for the other. So personally, I'm a little surprised at 24 minutes on that one, but on the V carving. So I'm going to go back and look at something on V carving. Let's go in and look at the details on this tool bit. Everything looks fine here. Oh, look at this pass depth. See that 0.01? That's what's doing it. That's a really tiny pass depth. So as I said before, if something doesn't seem right, doesn't smell right, go find out why. So I'm going to go back to my main tool database. There's my V-bit, and there's my pass depth. That should have been 0.1. And this is how you kind of chase out errors. So let's select that, recalculate that. Let's close out of that. Now let's go back into the time estimator and look at that, 3 minutes. What a difference. So what that's telling us, based on the settings, it's going to take 3 minutes, about 3.5 minutes for each of those bits to cut. Now, there's a couple things to think about. The rapid rate, remember how we talked about this red line being where the router is traveling through the air? That's called a rapid movement. And CNCs are set up that when they go up to do a rapid move, if possible, they'll travel at their maximum speed. So this long red line here, it's definitely going to come up to maximum speed, but these short red lines, it may not be able to come up to speed. It's kind of like you're driving through a neighborhood. You know, you're turning the corner, you go 1 block, you can hardly come up to freeway speed in a neighborhood where the blocks are short. But we got a long stretch, then you can come up to speed. Same thing with the rapid speed. 200 inches a minute is the maximum default for NextWave's HD 5 series. Now, those of you who have an HD 544, their new 4x4 foot machine, I believe that has a faster rapid speed, but I'm not sure what it is because I haven't had a chance to work with that tool yet. But you could contact them, or it might even be in the manual. The other thing that you talk about is scale factor. Scale factor is a relative number, and it's kind of tricky because in a perfect world, a 1 would probably give you the best, the most accurate. But what I find is that for a lot of V carving, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5, 1.6, 1.7 seems to give me a more accurate number. Notice how if I change this to 1, how these numbers changed up here. Now they're about 2 minutes. If I change it to 2, they're 4 minutes. So the 1.5 is kind of in between. So here's kind of the reality check on time estimator. It's far from a perfect tool. There's just a lot it doesn't know about your machine. There's no way that Vectric knows how let alone your rapid rate is, how the rest of your machines run, because machines also have built in what are called ramps. So every time it comes to quarter, it overrides your feed rate and slows the tool down and then speeds it up. It's almost imperceptible when you're watching it, but if you study your tool, you'll notice when it comes to a quarter, it actually pauses just ever so slightly and goes around. Those slight pauses add up over time, and that can also affect your estimated time. So scale factor, what I usually do, and that's why I've kind of settled here at 1.5 on this, is cut this project out and actually time it. And then go back and say, okay, how long did it actually take the VCarve and the cutout? And do a couple of test projects and then go back into your program and make a note of which scale factor gets you the most accurate time. And then for future projects, you could keep using that scale factor and you should be in pretty good shape. The part of the tricky thing with that, however, is that V-carving, profile cutting, 3D carving, all can have slightly different scale factors.
Yeah, I got a couple, Randy.
Yeah, go ahead.
If I'm doing a profile cut on a circle,
Okay.
and is there a ramp for circles, or you just click on the ramp and it'll automatically follow the toolpath?
It will. It'll be automatic.
It will.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, in fact, let me just, I'll show you an example here. I can actually draw a circle over here. It doesn't have to be on the material. And I will do this cutout. I'll apply that to that circle. And here's a ramp. And let's do cutout. And see that light blue line right
Yep.
there? That
Yep.
represents the ramp. So every time it comes around, it cuts off the last ramp and starts a new one. So it kind of ends up being one after the other.
Okay.
Yep.
And that'll just stay flat bottom on the final pass.
It'll do a flat bottom. One final pass around the flat bottom. Yep.
Okay. And then another thing, when you had up before about the in the design end of it, the rectangle,
Yes.
it showed boxes where you can put in dimensions rather than, you know, on the drawing where you could change dimensions. Is it in
Okay,
a 2D
right here.
view?
Yep. Right
Yeah,
here.
there you go.
Yep.
How do you get those boxes?
There. Okay. So see that white dot?
Yeah.
I'm
yeah.
going over that.
Okay.
So now when I clicked on that kind of locked those open. So
Right.
I could go in, and if I want to change that width and then hit enter, then it just changed it.
Right. Right.
So that's how you would access that.
I
And
didn't
it
know
looks
that
like
was I didn't know that was something specific to Pro as
Yeah.
opposed to desktop or what, but because I haven't been able to find that.
how
I've
to
seen
access those.
tutorials somewheres, but
Yeah, so now notice again, that white corner is the secret.
and then how do you keep it lit so you can go over to it to change? Click on it.
So yeah, so I select the vector,
Yeah.
I click on the white box,
Okay.
and
they
then
just
that
change the
activated
dimension.
that one down there. See how it's gray?
Yep.
And I bet you if I hit tab, it'll go up to the other one. Yep, I could tab
Okay.
between the two.
Tab. Okay. Okay.
Same thing's happening on this screen up here, but on the 2D window, in order to change it, you need to go into the set size, which is the more common way of doing it. But
Yeah. Yeah.
I can do that in here as well, like that.
Right. But you got to open up the design window to do
Right,
that.
and that's one of the advantages that Vectric, they added this vector editing capability within the 3D window.
Right.
But it's a little trickier to use until you get used to it. So, but that's how you would do it.
Yeah. And one other question. I have one thing I'm doing where I have like 6 different tool paths for a 1/4 inch end mill. How do I combine them all together? I thought I saw somewhere you just drag them, but it doesn't work.
So let's so this cutout, this is a profile toolpath right here. Okay, we created that.
Mm-hmm.
This is a little bit advanced, but let me cover this. I can duplicate that multiple times like that, okay?
Right.
And each of those could be associated with a different vector in my design.
Correct.
But because it's the same bit, I could save those all together. So I would highlight them all like that, check the boxes, go to the save, and then I would select this second one. And
Okay.
see how it says visible? And
Mhm.
remember, the ones with the check boxes are the visible tool paths, and then
okay.
it'll combine them into one tap file.
Okay. It just takes up a lot of room, you know, having 6 things when you don't really need all 6 on your
Oh,
flash
it
drive.
absolutely does. And plus it runs that way, they run all one right after the other.
Right. You don't have to keep starting and stopping.
Exactly.
Okay. Whatever. Oh yeah. One other thing. Um, I didn't have time to finish running the whole program. I had like 2 toolpaths still to run. So I returned my machine to the datum point and shut it off. And then the next day when I went back, I turned it back on. And without moving anything, I zeroed XY and it got all screwed up. But then I reran the whole thing, through all the tool paths and it works fine. The design. So you can't shut the machine off and restart it.
Well, you said you said two things that were correct and one thing that was puzzling.
Okay.
Where was your data point? The middle of your board or
Center.
the
It was in
center?
the center.
So when you shut your machine off, you ran it back to 00 and parked it there,
Correct.
and then you shut the machine off.
Correct.
So the next day you have the small pendant or the large pendant?
Small.
Okay. So when you turn the machine back on, the small pendant automatically defaults to that location as XY0. So
Okay.
there's no need to re-zero the XY because you stopped it at 0 and it opens wherever your machine is when you park it, that becomes 0 when you restart your machine. So you were doing the right thing to move it back to your data point and shut it off there because then it automatically starts up at 00. That's a good thing. The only thing you have to do possibly is to re-zero the router bit for the Z.
Right. Yeah, I did that also.
Okay. But you said you re-zeroed the XY and it got off.
Yeah. When I had I was doing your I love horses sign from your book. And I ran everything except for the finish 3D and the cutout. Okay, so the roughing was done on the 3D. And then when I ran the finishing on the 3D, it was off by about a ½ inch to the left.
Well, when you re-zeroed the XY, what did you move the machine when you re-zeroed it?
No.
Oh, okay.
I turned the power on, and the first thing I did was 0 XY.
But it already was at 0, wasn't it?
Yeah, but I didn't know if it would remember.
I see what you're saying. Right. Okay. Yeah, that's not the expected behavior. It should have been fine. I do what you're doing often. I'll park it at that same. I just finished about a 5-day project where every day I went out there, I had to start it up again. And it had a very strange 0 location. So I parked it at that 0 to restart the next day. To be honest with you, I did have one day where it was off by a ½ inch and I had to recalibrate it. I can't explain why that happened.
Yeah. Okay. The next day after it got screwed up, I took a new piece of wood, I put it on, I ran all the programs, and it came out fine.
Good.
So it was just something a little wacky, I guess. When you power up the machine, you hear a clunk.
Yeah,
I don't know what that is, whether it's moving one of the axes or it's just a spindle.
That typically, so the stepper motors have magnets in them, or they're basically electromagnets. So when you power it up, those electromagnets kick in, and that clunk you hear is those electric magnets aligning themselves. But it usually is just a smallest fraction of an inch, so it's not an issue.
Okay.
The only other possibility that can happen is that if your machine got bumped after you turned it off by that ½ inch amount, then when you restart it would have been off from where you thought it was.
Yeah. So, I don't know.
But otherwise, you were on the right track for doing that.
So you don't need to re-zero.
Yeah. Have you watched my pendant video last week?
No, but I did your pendant class 2 months ago or whatever.
Okay. Well, in the pendant webinar or the pendant class, I teach it several times during the winter, so it's probably the same one. But if you go back and view that, I talk about making use of the homing routine. Which machine?
Right.
Which machine do you have?
500.
Okay. Well, the 500 has homing. So by using homing, you could guarantee yourself getting back to your zero location if you set it up with an offset.
Yeah, I haven't figured out the homing part yet.
Okay, go back. Yeah, for that application, it's really handy. It's probably worth going back and reviewing that. I'd recommend that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess that's my questions for now.
Okay, great. Anybody else? Okay, then we'll call it a wrap. Again, don't hesitate to drop me an email. I'll send the video out later tomorrow. If any of you are looking for information ready to carve, I'll be doing that, or rather ready to control. I'll be doing that webinar next Tuesday night. And then 2 weeks from tonight, we'll do class 2 of the VCarve class. And I look forward to seeing you then again. Have a good week. Take care.